The villagers would never forget the smell. It was thick, suffocating, and unlike anything they had ever known. Some described it as rotten fruit. Others swore it was like burned flesh mixed with decay. Whatever it was, the air around the coconut grove became heavy that summer morning, and no one in the small farming community could explain why. At first, people thought maybe an animal had died in the grove. Stray dogs often wandered too far, sometimes pigs, sometimes even cattle, but the odor was too strong, too overwhelming to be just one animal. And when the flies began to swarm in clouds so black they looked like smoke from a distance, the villagers grew uneasy. Children were the first to run back from the grove screaming, their tiny hands pointing at the ground, their eyes wide with terror. They claimed they had seen bones sticking out of the dirt, white and jagged like broken porcelain. Most of the adults didn't believe them at first. Kids had wild imaginations, after all. But curiosity overcame doubt, and soon the men of the village walked down the narrow dirt path that led into the trees. The grove was silent. No birds, no rustle of leaves, only the sound of flies buzzing like a constant electric hum. The men stopped at the clearing, and that was when they saw it for themselves. The earth had been disturbed, clumps of soil turned over in messy mounds, and from those shallow graves, something was pushing through. A piece of cloth, stained and torn, a hand, grey and shriveled, its nails cracked, reaching upward as though clawing for escape. And then, bones, dozens of them. The men froze, their stomachs lurching. This wasn't one body, it wasn't even two. There were countless shapes, countless fragments scattered beneath the soil, some partially buried, some exposed entirely. One of the elders whispered, his voice trembling, "Ya Allah, they're human." Panic spread like fire. Within minutes, the grove was filled with shouting, with people running back to the village, calling for help, screaming about the dead buried beneath their very feet. Mothers clutched their children, dragging them away. Men covered their mouths and noses with cloth to block out the rancid stench. Nobody wanted to believe what they had just seen, but there was no denying it. The coconut grove had become a graveyard. When the police finally arrived, the scene was chaos. 100 villagers crowded the edges of the grove, their faces pale, their voices rising in confusion and fear. The officers tried to push them back, but even they were shaken. No training had prepared them for this. As the first team of investigators knelt in the dirt, carefully pulling back soil with gloved hands, the nightmare revealed itself layer by layer. Skulls, ribs, femurs, tangled together like discarded dolls. Some skeletons were fresh enough that flesh still clung to the bone. Others were nothing more than brittle remains, years old. And as the count began, so did the horror. 5 bodies, then 10, then 20. By the time the sun dipped low and cast long shadows through the trees, the number had climbed higher than anyone could comprehend. 46 bodies, men, women, and even children. The villagers stood in stunned silence as the announcement was made. 46 human lives had ended in their quiet little town, their remains hidden beneath the very trees they had walked past for years. The police tried to calm the crowd, but whispers ran wild. Who could have done such a thing? How long had the grove been hiding this secret? And, most terrifying of all, were the killers still among them? Fear gripped every household that night. Doors were bolted shut, lanterns burned until dawn. Children cried in their mothers' arms, while fathers stood guard with makeshift weapons, their eyes scanning the darkness outside. This was no ordinary tragedy. This was a crime so monstrous, so unthinkable, that it would haunt the community forever. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because as investigators dug deeper, not just into the soil, but into the lives of the people connected to this land, they uncovered a truth that would not only shock the village, but shake the nation itself. A truth so disturbing, so horrifying, that the coconut grove would never again be remembered as just a field of trees, but as the resting place of the forgotten 46 asterisk. Before the discovery in the grove, the village was the kind of place people described as untouched. Nestled between rolling fields of sugarcane and the glistening coastline, it was small enough that everyone knew each other's names, and big enough to feel alive with tradition and routine. Life moved slowly there, following the rhythm of the seasons rather than the ticking of clocks. The mornings always began the same. Farmers walked barefoot down the dirt paths, carrying sickles across their shoulders as roosters crowed from behind bamboo fences. Children ran through the narrow lanes with satchels slung over their backs, shouting greetings as they made their way to the only school in town. One-story building with faded blue paint and a bell that rang twice a day. Women gathered at the communal well to draw water, their laughter echoing as they traded gossip while balancing heavy pots on their heads. In the evenings, smoke rose from every kitchen as families cooked rice, lentils, or roasted fish wrapped in banana leaves. The air smelled of wood, fire, and spices, and the sound of prayers drifted softly from the mosque at dusk. For the villagers, life felt safe, predictable, and deeply rooted in community. That it was here, in this seemingly ordinary place, that families had lived for generations. Land passed down from fathers to sons, recipes passed down from mothers to daughters. No one imagined their village would one day make headlines, not for celebration, but for horror. The grove itself was older than anyone could remember. Towering trees swayed gently in the wind, their leaves clattering like dry bones, while coconuts hung in heavy clusters above. To the villagers, the grove was both ordinary and sacred. Farmers harvested coconuts to sell at the weekly market. Children played hide-and-seek among the trees. Lovers sometimes met there in secret, away from the eyes of the community. And when the summer heat grew unbearable, it was a cool refuge place where men gathered to rest, talk politics, or simply escape the midday sun. Nobody thought of it as dangerous. It was part of their lives, as familiar as the fields or the river, and that is what made the discovery so unthinkable. Among the families who lived closest to the grove was the Karim family. Karim, a father of 3, worked as a carpenter. His small workshop sat at the edge of the village, where he built wooden furniture for neighbors and sometimes repaired fishing boats. His wife Salma was known for her kindness. She often brought food to widows and orphans, even when her own pantry was nearly empty. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, were like most others in the village, playful, mischievous, and unaware of the darkness that lay hidden in the soil just a short walk from their home. A few houses down lived the Rahmans. Old Rahman was one of the village elders, respected for his wisdom and memory of the past. He remembered the grove when it was smaller, before storms knocked down half its trees. To him it was a place of stories. He often warned children not to wander there at night, not because of crime, but because he believed spirits roamed the shadows. Nobody took his warnings seriously. At least not until the bodies surfaced. In the weeks leading up to the discovery, life carried on as it always had. There were weddings in the community hall where drums and laughter carried late into the night. There were disputes over farmland boundaries that were settled by elders sitting on wooden stools beneath the banyan tree. There were festivals, market days, school recitals, all the small, ordinary events that stitched together the fabric of daily life. The villagers worried about common problems: the price of rice, the rising heat, a broken irrigation channel. Crime was rare, petty thefts, drunken arguments, nothing more. People left their doors unlocked, confident in the safety of their surroundings. Children walked home after sunset without fear. That it was this sense of peace, this illusion of security, that made the crime so deeply unsettling. The village believed it was immune to the horrors of the outside world. Murders happened in big cities, far away. Serial killers belonged to television dramas, not to their quiet reality. And then came the smell. The day before the bodies were found, nothing seemed unusual. Farmers went to the fields. The market bustled with chatter. Children played cricket in the dusty schoolyard, their laughter echoing across the valley. The coconut grove stood silently in the distance, its leaves rustling in the warm breeze. But for those who lived closest, there were subtle signs. Stray dogs gathered near the grove more than usual, digging at the soil. The flies seemed thicker than ever, buzzing in great swarms. A few villagers complained of nausea when passing by, saying the air smelled off, like spoiled fruit. Still, nobody suspected the truth. That evening, Karim's youngest son told his mother that he'd seen something scary while playing near the grove. White stones, he called them, sticking out of the dirt. Salma scolded him for making up stories and sent him to bed. By dawn, however, those stones would reveal themselves for what they truly were. Looking back, villagers would often speak of those final days of innocence with a kind of grief. They remembered how safe they had felt, how unshaken their faith in each other had been. After the discovery, that trust was gone. The grove, once a place of shade and laughter, became a site of nightmares. Parents no longer allowed their children to wander freely. Doors were locked at night. The elders spoke in hushed tones, wondering how such evil had taken root in their midst. Before, the village had been a place where everyone belonged to everyone else, where neighbors were family and secrets were rare. But after, suspicion grew like a weed, poisoning every relationship. People began asking questions they had never dared to ask before. Who among us could hide such cruelty? How long had it been happening, and why had no one seen it? What had once been ordinary life was shattered, replaced by a haunting realization. Safety had only ever been an illusion, and as the investigation began, it would reveal not just the scale of the crime, but the darkness that can hide in even the quietest, most peaceful of places. The morning of the discovery began like any other. The sun rose over the fields, spilling gold across the rooftops. Roosters crowed, women carried water, children chased one another through narrow lanes. Nobody knew that within hours, their world would collapse. The grove, that cluster of trees that had stood quietly at the edge of the village for generations, was about to reveal the darkest truth imaginable. It began with a smell, not a passing stench, but a thick, clinging odor that seemed to seep into the very air. People passing by the grove wrinkled their noses, covering their mouths with cloths. At first they assumed an animal had died, perhaps left to rot beneath the shade of the trees. But the smell did not fade. It grew stronger, heavier, until it followed them home, clinging to their clothes, their hair, their skin. Children playing near the grove were the first to notice more than the smell. They stumbled back, screaming, claiming they had seen something sticking out of the dirt. One boy, no older than 9, insisted he saw a hand, its fingers bent in unnatural directions. His friends swore they had seen bones, pale and gleaming under the sun. When they ran to their parents, their words were dismissed as childish imagination, but curiosity got the better of the men, and they decided to investigate. The moment they stepped into the grove, everything changed. The buzzing of flies was so loud it seemed to vibrate in their ears. The soil was uneven, mounds of earth piled carelessly, as though someone had dug in haste. A piece of fabric fluttered from the dirt, stained brown and stiff with age. And then they saw the truth. A hand, shriveled and gray, reached upward from the ground, its nails broken and black. Just beyond it lay a skull, half buried, its empty sockets staring blindly into the canopy above. The men staggered back in shock. One clutched his chest, whispering a prayer under his breath. Another fell to his knees, vomiting onto the soil. They knew instantly this was no animal grave. These were humans, and not just one. The ground around them was littered with fragments, ribs, femurs, entire skeletons piled together, some still wrapped in tattered clothing. Word spread like wildfire. Within minutes, the grove was filled with villagers, their voices overlapping in panic and disbelief. Mothers clutched their children tightly, shielding their eyes from the sight. Elders muttered about curses and unclean spirits, their hands trembling as they clutched prayer beads. No one could believe what they were seeing. The police were summoned, though few believed they would arrive quickly, but for once, urgency cut through the usual delays. By mid-morning, officers stood at the edge of the grove, trying to push the growing crowd back. Even they were unprepared. The stench, the sight of flesh still clinging to bone, it was more than any of them had trained for. Masks were pulled over faces, gloves were snapped on, and a grim excavation began. Each shovelful of dirt revealed another horror. A child's shoe, a lock of hair matted with soil, pieces of jewelry, anklets, bangles, rings that once belonged to the living but now glinted coldly in the sunlight. The bodies came in layers, stacked upon one another as though they were no more than discarded garbage. Some were fresh enough that their skin still carried color. Others had long since decomposed into skeletons. The scale was unimaginable. At first the officers counted aloud, each discovery punctuating the silence of the crowd. 5 bodies, then 10, then 15. But as the hours passed, the numbers grew so high that counting out loud felt meaningless. By sunset, the grim tally had reached 46, men, women, and children alike. 46 human lives, buried in shallow graves beneath the coconut trees. The villagers stood in stunned silence, their faces pale, their voices hushed. Some wept openly, wailing into the night as the reality set in. Others grew angry, demanding answers from the police, from the elders, from anyone who might explain how such a thing had gone unnoticed for so long. Whispers spread quickly, theories forming in the chaos. Some swore the grove was cursed, that the land itself was swallowing people whole. Others whispered darker possibilities, that a killer had lived among them, hiding in plain sight. Families rushed home that night, locking their doors, peeking through curtains at every shadow. Fathers stayed awake with machetes by their beds. Mothers tried to soothe their children, though their own eyes were wide with fear. No one felt safe. If 46 people could vanish without anyone noticing, then who might be next? For the families who had long mourned missing loved ones, the discovery struck with brutal force. Mothers who had lost daughters years earlier came to the grove, their cries echoing through the night as they begged to know if their children were among the dead. Fathers stood rigid, fists clenched, fighting tears as they watched investigators carry body after body out of the soil. Each discovery reopened wounds that had never fully healed. The police worked through the night under the glow of lanterns. They documented every body, marking the graves with wooden stakes, carefully bagging evidence. but the scale of the crime overwhelmed them. Their radios buzzed with urgent calls for reinforcements, for forensic teams, for anyone who could help make sense of the nightmare. Meanwhile, the villagers gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves. Some were convinced the work of a single madman was responsible. Others suspected a group, perhaps even a cult. There were those who believed the government itself had hidden the bodies for reasons no one dared speak aloud. And through it all, one question hung heavily in the air. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? The grove had always been part of their lives. Children had played there, farmers had walked its paths daily, lovers had carved initials into its trunks. And yet beneath their feet, for years, the earth had been hiding the dead. By dawn, the coconut grove was no longer a place of refuge. It was a crime scene, cordoned off with ropes and guarded by armed officers. The villagers watched from a distance, their faces grim, their hearts heavy with dread. The truth was undeniable. Someone had turned their peaceful home into a burial ground. Someone had killed 46 people and buried them in plain sight. And as the investigation began, so did the fear. Because if the killer had managed to hide this horror for so long, then perhaps they were still out there, watching, waiting, blending in among the very people who now trembled at every shadow. The first night after the discovery felt endless. Lanterns flickered across the grove as officers worked in silence, their faces hidden behind masks, their movements heavy with dread. Each time a body was lifted from the soil, an audible gasp escaped the villagers who stood just beyond the cordon. Mothers clutched their scarves to their mouths to stifle cries. Men stood with arms crossed, eyes narrowed, trying to process the scale of what was unfolding before them. By dawn, reinforcements had arrived. Trucks rumbled down the dirt road, carrying more officers, investigators, and forensic teams. They brought with them equipment the villagers had never seen before: cameras with blinding flashes, plastic evidence markers, metal cases filled with brushes and powders, long steel probes to test the soil. The grove, once a place of play and peace, had become a laboratory of death. The officers moved methodically. Each shallow grave was mapped, each body photographed before removal. They marked the ground with numbers until the grove looked like a battlefield frozen in time. Dozens of evidence bags filled with scraps of clothing, jewelry, and personal belongings lined the edge of the crime scene. Reporters began to arrive as well, their vans parked in long rows along the road. Cameras clicked, microphones extended, and suddenly the villagers found their home transformed into the center of national attention. The questions came fast and sharp. Who were the victims? How long had they been buried there? Who could have done this? The police had no answers yet, but the public demanded them. News anchors described it as one of the worst crimes in recent memory. Headlines screamed of a mass grave discovered in a sleepy coastal village. Journalists wandered the lanes, shoving cameras into faces, asking villagers if they had noticed anything strange, if they had ever suspected their neighbors. For a community that had lived in obscurity for generations, the sudden spotlight was as jarring as it was terrifying. Inside the grove, the forensic teams began their grim work. They examined the bodies, noting signs of trauma. Some skeletons bore fractures that suggested blunt force injuries. Others showed marks consistent with strangulation. A few of the fresher remains had rope burns still visible on the wrists and ankles, evidence that these victims had been bound. For the older skeletons, the cause of death was harder to determine, but the message was the same. These people had not died naturally. They had been murdered. The timeline was chilling. Some bodies appeared to be only a few months old, while others had been in the ground for years. This was not a single event. This had happened again and again, over a long stretch of time. Each new layer of soil told the same story of cruelty repeated with methodical precision. Whoever had done this had returned to the grove, time after time, confident that no one would ever discover their secret. That as the investigation widened, police began visiting every home in the village. They knocked on doors, asking questions that felt intrusive but necessary. Had anyone noticed strangers passing through? Had anyone heard screams at night? Had anyone's family members gone missing? The villagers answered with trembling voices. Some admitted they had lost relatives years ago, people who had vanished without explanation. Others swore they had heard unusual sounds from the grave shoveling, muffled cries, but had dismissed them as imagination. In a community where silence was often safer than suspicion, too many things had gone unspoken. The families of the missing gathered outside the local station, holding faded photographs of sons, daughters, husbands, wives. They begged for answers, for confirmation, for anything to ease the uncertainty. Each day they crowded around the officers, hoping to identify scraps of clothing or jewelry. A red bangle matched a young woman who had vanished 3 summers ago. A school badge was recognized by the parents of a boy who never returned from class. Piece by piece, names were given to the faceless dead, and with each identification came fresh waves of grief. The police, overwhelmed by the scale of the case, began compiling lists of possible suspects. At first, suspicion fell on outsiders, seasonal workers, travelers, anyone who didn't belong to the village. But soon the investigators realized the truth was likely closer to home. The grove was not far from the houses. Whoever had buried the bodies there had taken an enormous risk. They had to know the area well, to move unnoticed through familiar paths. This pointed not to strangers, but to someone within the community. Rumors spread faster than facts. Villagers whispered about men with violent tempers, about families with dark secrets. One name after another surfaced, whispered in alleys, muttered in the market. Every eccentric old man, every reclusive farmer, every family with a missing member became a target of suspicion. Neighbors eyed each other with distrust. Friendships cracked under the weight of fear. In a place where everyone had once known each other, suddenly no one felt they truly knew anyone at all. Meanwhile, the police traced back old missing persons cases. Files were pulled from dusty cabinets, records reread by tired eyes. Some cases stretched back nearly a decade. Women who had left home for errands and never returned. Men who had gone fishing and vanished. Children who had disappeared on the way to school. Each cold case now carried new, horrifying weight. Perhaps their answers had always been lying silently beneath the coconut trees. Forensic analysis offered more clues. Soil samples revealed disturbances at different depths, confirming that the burials had occurred over years. The positioning of the bodies suggested haste. They were not carefully laid to rest, but thrown into the ground without dignity. Some graves contained multiple victims, piled together as though their lives and deaths were meaningless. The discovery of ropes, blindfolds and scraps of clothing painted a picture of captivity before death. These people had suffered. They had been restrained, silenced, stripped of their last freedoms before being buried like refuse. The investigators, hardened though they were, struggled with the weight of what they uncovered. One officer was overheard saying, in a broken voice, that it was the worst thing he had ever seen in his career. As the days stretched into weeks, the media pressure intensified. Reporters demanded answers. Officials gave carefully worded statements, promising justice, urging patience. But the villagers had no patience left. Each night, they gathered in the square, demanding arrests. Fear turned to anger. They wanted names, confessions, punishment. They wanted the nightmare to end. The investigation took a toll on the families most of all. Some clung to hope that their loved ones were not among the dead, praying that maybe, just maybe, they had run away to another town. Others, faced with undeniable evidence, collapsed under the weight of grief. The cries of mothers echoed through the village night after night, their voices hoarse from wailing. Fathers sat in silence, staring at the ground, their eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Children, confused and frightened, asked questions that no one could answer. One evening, a woman named Yasmin came to the grove carrying a faded scarf. She pressed it to her face, inhaling deeply as she confirmed it belonged to her daughter, who had disappeared 2 years earlier. Her scream, raw and unending, carried through the trees like a curse. The investigators paused their work, heads bowed. The villagers fell silent, each of them feeling her pain as if it were their own. Despite the grief, the police pressed forward. They interviewed every possible suspect, cross-checking alibis, searching homes. They brought in forensic experts from the city who examined fingerprints, analyzed soil, tested DNA. Progress was slow, but each new discovery narrowed the circle of possibilities. Still, fear lingered. The villagers locked their doors at dusk. Lanterns burned through the night. No one trusted the dark anymore. Every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves sent chills down spines. And in the silence between investigations, one question whispered through every household. If the killer had hidden among them for this long, were they still out there, watching, waiting for another chance to strike? In every true crime story, there comes a moment when the weight of uncertainty shifts onto the shoulders of the living. After the initial shock, after the discovery of bodies and the frantic investigation, people begin to ask questions, the kind of questions that carry both suspicion and fear. Who could have done this? Why here? Why to them? In Coconut Grove, the tragedy was no longer just a mystery. It was a puzzle that seemed to grow more complicated with each day, and they seemed to come from every corner of the village. The police began with the most obvious suspects, those closest to the victims. History shows that investigators often start with family because, statistically, violence tends to come from within circles of trust rather than from strangers. Relatives of the missing were questioned one by one. Husbands, wives, brothers, and cousins all asked to recount where they were on the nights leading up to the discovery. For many families, grief was compounded with the sting of being treated like potential criminals. Imagine sitting in a small, dimly lit room, tears still fresh on your face, while an officer asks if you could have harmed your own blood. For some, it was unbearable, but for police, it was necessary. One name surfaced repeatedly in whispers across the community. A man called Ramiro. He was a middle-aged farmer who owned land not far from the grove where the bodies were found. Ramiro had a reputation for being short-tempered, especially when drinking, and neighbors claimed he often muttered darkly about curses and debts unpaid. Some even remembered hearing him argue with two of the men who were later found among the dead. Was it enough to mark him as a suspect? Perhaps not in a courtroom, but in the eyes of frightened villagers, it was more than enough. People said they had seen him walking near the grove late at night, carrying tools and muttering under his breath. Others swore they had heard strange noises from his property shovel scraping, doors slamming, voices that weren't answered. But Ramiro wasn't the only one under scrutiny. Soon, attention shifted to a group of outsiders who had recently moved into the area. 3 men who worked on construction projects in a nearby town. They rented a small shack near the edge of the village and kept mostly to themselves. No one really knew their names, only that they came and went at odd hours, often carrying heavy sacks. Rumors spread quickly. Were these men smugglers? Were they part of some hidden trade, moving contraband through the quiet village? And if so, could the victims have stumbled onto something they weren't meant to see? Theories multiplied. Some villagers claimed the men were seen with machetes. Others insisted they had been caught burning something in barrels behind their shack. Fear made imaginations run wild, and soon the outsiders were being described as shadowy figures who lurked at the edges of the coconut grove, waiting for prey. The police interrogated them, of course. They were brought in, questioned, and photographed. Yet nothing concrete tied them to the crime. Their alibis were shaky, but not impossible. Still, the tension in the community thickened. Mothers pulled their children inside at night. Men formed informal patrols, walking with lanterns and sticks. Everyone wanted to believe the killer or killers were someone else's problem, someone outside the circle. But doubt has a way of poisoning even the closest bonds. Another theory emerged that rattled the villagers even more. Some began to suspect that deaths were tied to old feuds within the community itself. It was said that decades ago, a bitter land dispute had divided 2 families, leading to violence and threats that never fully healed. The grove where the bodies were found, according to older residents, was part of that disputed land. Could the killings be an act of revenge, carried out years later, when memories had cooled but grudges had not? The idea spread quickly, because it felt almost logical, a blood debt being repaid in blood. But when investigators asked for proof, none came. Only hushed voices and knowing glances. The lack of clear answers gave rise to even stranger theories, ones rooted not in reason but in folklore. Some villagers whispered about rituals, about sacrifices made to restless spirits of the land. They spoke of the coconut grove as a place where shadows moved differently, where birds refused to roost, where the air itself felt wrong. For them, the bodies were not just victims of human violence, but offerings in some dark ritual. It sounded absurd to outsiders, but inside the village, the fear was real. People began avoiding the grove altogether, and those forced to pass near it would clutch charms or murmur prayers under their breath for the police. Superstition was both a curse and a tool. It clouded rational investigation, but it also loosened tongues. People who might otherwise have stayed silent came forward with stories, desperate to rid themselves of the fear. Some claimed to have seen lights flickering among the trees at midnight. Others swore they heard chanting. Every new testimony added fuel to the fire, and the theories expanded like smoke. Meanwhile, the media feasted on the story. Reporters painted the village as a haunted place, torn apart by suspicion and secrecy. Every newspaper headline demanded answers, and every photograph of grieving families stoked the public's anger. Theories grew wilder in print. One tabloid claimed the bodies were victims of a traveling cult. Another suggested drug traffickers had used the grove as a dumping ground. Each theory brought fresh scrutiny, and each headline deepened the villagers' isolation. They felt hunted not only by a killer, but by the gaze of the nation itself. In the midst of all this, one man emerged as a particularly compelling suspect, a local teacher named Esteban. Unlike the others, Esteban was respected, even admired. He had taught generations of children and was often seen at church, helping with community events. But behind closed doors, There were whispers. Some said he had a fascination with dark literature, books about rituals and forbidden practices. Others recalled his strange lessons, where he would linger on stories of death and justice. When investigators searched his modest home, they found notebooks filled with sketches and writings that many found disturbing drawings of trees, marked with strange symbols, and long passages about justice being taken by the hand of the earth. It was enough to terrify the families of the victims, who demanded answers. Yet once again, there was no hard evidence. Esteban had alibis for the nights in question. He denied any involvement and insisted his writings were nothing more than personal reflections, misunderstood by outsiders. But suspicion doesn't fade easily, and soon his reputation crumbled. Parents stopped sending their children to his classes. Friends stopped visiting. Even in the absence of proof, the village decided he was guilty of something. By this stage of the investigation, the theories had fractured the community. Some were convinced it was an outsider, others believed it was one of their own. Distrust grew so thick that even long-standing friendships were tested. Neighbors accused neighbors. Families split apart. The police, overwhelmed with contradictory testimonies, struggled to separate truth from paranoia. Every suspect seemed plausible, and yet none could be conclusively tied to the crime. It was as though the truth itself was hiding, buried as deeply as the bodies in the grove. And so, the case reached a boiling point. Theories hung in the air like smoke, each one more sinister than the last. But amid the confusion, investigators clung to one hope, that somewhere, among the suspects and the rumors, a breakthrough waited. A single thread that, once pulled, would unravel the tangled knot of lies, fears, and suspicions. For weeks, the case had been nothing but shadows and dead ends. Suspicions circled like vultures over the village, swooping from one suspect to another, never landing for long. The coconut grove stood silent, its trees swaying in the wind as if mocking the investigators who could not pierce its secrets. But then, just when hope seemed to be fading, a small, overlooked detail surfaced, one that would change the entire course of the investigation. That began not with a dramatic confession or a new body, but with a scrap of fabric. A forensic team, combing the grove yet again, found it snagged on the bark of a coconut tree at the very edge of the clearing. It was a piece of cloth, faded and torn, but still recognizable, part of a shirt sleeve. What made it unusual wasn't just the fact that it had been missed before, but the pattern printed on the fabric. It was checkered, blue and white, the kind of design that was rare in the small village, where most men wore plain cotton shirts. Investigators remembered seeing a shirt like that on only one man, Ramiro, the hot-tempered farmer who had been among the earliest suspects. When confronted, Ramiro claimed he had lost that shirt months earlier. He insisted someone must have stolen it, maybe to frame him. But investigators pressed harder. A witness, a young boy who often wandered the village unnoticed, suddenly recalled seeing Ramiro wearing that very shirt on the night before the bodies were discovered. The boy's memory wasn't perfect. He said it could have been dark, and he couldn't be sure, but his words reignited interest in the farmer. The turning point, however, didn't come from Ramiro's denials. It came from the soil itself. Forensic specialists dug deeper around the grove, this time with more precise equipment, and uncovered something chilling. Traces of lime, the chemical often used to hasten decomposition. This wasn't just random violence. They realized it was planned. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure the bodies disappeared quickly. The discovery shifted the narrative. Whoever committed this crime wasn't acting in sudden rage. They were calculating, prepared, and disturbingly methodical. As if on cue, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. A villager came forward, a woman who had been too frightened to speak earlier. She claimed that on the nights before the discovery, she had seen lights flickering in the grove. At first she thought they were fireflies or lanterns, but the movements were too deliberate. She described shadows, multiple figures moving between the trees, carrying something heavy. She hadn't told anyone because she feared being targeted herself, but after weeks of sleepless nights, her conscience forced her to speak. Her testimony was enough to reopen the questioning of not just Ramiro, but also the outsiders, the 3 construction workers who had already drawn suspicion. Their alibis had been shaky before, but now the inconsistencies began to unravel. One claimed he had been in the nearby town on the night in question, but bus records showed no such passenger. Another insisted he had been asleep in their shack, but a neighbor remembered hearing footsteps outside long after midnight. Piece by piece, their stories crumbled. The police, under pressure from the media and the grieving families, doubled their efforts. They brought in sniffer dogs, combed through the workers' belongings, and finally struck gold. Hidden in a sack of tools, they found a machete with traces of blood, so faint it was nearly invisible. Under laboratory testing, the blood was confirmed to belong to one of the victims. The discovery hit the community like a thunderclap. For the first time, there was physical evidence linking someone directly to the killings. But just as the villagers were ready to believe the nightmare was over, a shocking twist emerged. DNA testing revealed not just one set of fingerprints on the machete, but several. It wasn't the work of one man, it was a conspiracy. Multiple hands had wielded the weapon. Multiple people had taken part in the crime. The construction workers perhaps, but maybe others too. Suddenly, the scope of the case widened again, and the fear doubled. How many killers were walking among them? The breakthrough was terrifying, but it gave investigators a direction. They re-examined every suspect with new eyes. And then, another revelation arrived from the most unexpected source, a discarded phone, found half buried in the dirt near the grove. It was old, its screen cracked, but the memory card inside was intact. When examined, it revealed several photographs grainy taken at night, but unmistakable. The images showed men standing in the grove, their faces partially obscured, but their silhouettes clear. They were carrying sacks, digging, moving around the very trees where the bodies were later discovered. Even more chilling was a short video clip. Though blurred and shaky, the audio was clear enough. Voices could be heard, laughing nervously, speaking in hushed tones. And in that laughter, one voice stood out, recognizable to anyone who lived in the village. Esteban, the respected teacher, the same man who had filled his notebooks with strange writings and symbols. The community had doubted him, then dismissed him. But now, with his voice echoing in the dark grove, denial was impossible. The revelation shattered the village. How could a man who had taught their children, prayed beside them, and broken bread at their tables be part of something so monstrous? Parents who had once trusted him felt a cold, crawling sense of betrayal. Students who remembered his gentle smile now shivered at the memory. The facade of respectability crumbled, revealing something far darker beneath. For the investigators, this was the turning point they had been waiting for. The suspects were no longer faceless shadows, but people with ties, with motives, with secrets that connected them. The evidence formed a chain that bound them together. Ramiro's shirt, the outsider's machete, Esteban's voice. It wasn't just one suspect. It was a network, a collaboration born from greed, anger, or something even more sinister. As the pieces fell into place, one realization grew clearer. The grove hadn't been chosen at random. It was remote enough to conceal their acts, but symbolic to a place tied to old disputes, old grudges, and perhaps old rituals. Whether driven by money, revenge, or madness, the killers had chosen it deliberately, and in that choice lay the key to understanding their motives. For the families, the breakthrough brought a mix of emotions, relief that progress was being made, but dread at the thought of what it implied, that the killers weren't outsiders who would eventually leave, but people they knew, people they had trusted. The betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. The breakthrough didn't solve the case outright, but it changed everything. The fog of suspicion that had clouded the investigation was lifting. For the first time, the villagers and the police could see a path forward, a path that led directly to the perpetrators. But that path was still dark and dangerous, because the question remained, if they were capable of hiding 46 bodies in plain sight, what else were they capable of doing to keep their secrets buried? The silence that followed the breakthrough was unlike any silence the village had ever known. It wasn't the quiet of peace or the hush of a night breeze. It was a silence heavy with fear, with the realization that the killers were not strangers passing through, but neighbors, people who had shared laughter, meals, and prayers. The truth was out there now, waiting to be seized. But how much more devastation would it take to bring justice? The police moved quickly, almost too quickly for the villagers to comprehend. Within days, Ramiro was taken into custody. Officers stormed his farmhouse at dawn, dragging him out as his wife screamed and his children cried. The once proud farmer, his hands calloused from years of labor, now trembled like a trapped animal. He denied everything, of course. He claimed the shirt had been stolen, the soil planted, the witnesses mistaken, but when confronted with the photographs from the discarded phone, his eyes faltered. He turned pale, his lips quivering as though he were about to confess. Yet he said nothing. Silence became his only shield. The 3 construction workers were next. They didn't resist. They sat in the back of the police truck, heads bowed, their shack abandoned with doors left, swinging in the wind. The villagers gathered in clusters, staring at them with a mixture of rage and disbelief. For weeks they had been the outsiders, the easy scapegoats, but now, it seemed, at least some of the suspicion had been justified. When the machete with traces of blood was laid before them in the interrogation room, One of them broke down, his tough exterior crumbling. He muttered about debts, about being forced into things he didn't want to do, about threats that left him no choice. His confession was fragmented, tangled in fear, but it was enough to implicate others. And then came Esteban, the teacher, the one no one wanted to believe could be guilty. The police entered his modest home one evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village. Esteban didn't fight, didn't shout, didn't even deny it. He simply looked at the officers with tired eyes, as though he had been waiting for this moment. As they led him out, villagers lined the street, their whispers like knives cutting into the night. Parents clutched their children closer, as if the very sight of him might poison their innocence. Students who had once admired him stood frozen, unable to reconcile the gentleman with the voice recorded in the grove. In custody, Esteban finally spoke. His words chilled the room. He admitted he had been there in the grove. He admitted he had dug, carried, and buried. But he claimed he had not killed. He said he had been drawn into something larger, something orchestrated by men more powerful than himself. He painted himself as a pawn, a man trapped by threats and obligations he could not escape. I wanted to stop, he whispered, but by then, it was too late. Too much blood had already been spilled. The investigators listened, torn between anger and curiosity. If Esteban was telling the truth, then there were still others out there, others who had orchestrated the massacre, others who had not yet been unmasked. But if he was lying, then his calm confession was just another manipulation, another attempt to obscure the horror of his choices. Either way, the truth was tangled in his words, and untangling it would take time. The trial that followed was one of the most sensational the region had ever seen. Reporters crowded into the courthouse, their cameras flashing, their pens scribbling every word. Families of the victims filled the benches, clutching photographs of their loved ones, faces etched with grief and fury. One by one the accused were brought forward. Ramiro with his hardened scowl, the three workers, heads bowed, Esteban silent and unreadable. The evidence was laid out: the shirt, the machete, the photographs, the phone. Each piece painted a picture too horrifying to ignore. The prosecution argued it was a conspiracy of greed and fear. They claimed the men had been involved in illegal trade, perhaps smuggling, and the victims had stumbled upon it. To silence them, they had been lured to the grove and executed, their bodies buried in mass graves. The defense fought desperately, insisting the evidence was circumstantial, the confessions coerced, the interpretations flawed. But the jury, their faces pale and drawn, listened not just to the lawyers but to the silent weight of the victims' families. When the verdict came, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty, one word, repeated again and again as each man's fate was sealed. Ramiro, guilty. The workers, guilty. Esteban, guilty. The sound echoed through the room, a hammer striking the very heart of the village. Sentences were handed down: life in prison for all, with no possibility of parole. Justice, at least in the eyes of the law, had been served, but justice in the hearts of the villagers was another matter entirely. For many, the wounds remained open, bleeding in ways no verdict could heal. Parents wept for children who would never come home. Wives mourned husbands, siblings mourned brothers. 46 lives had been extinguished, and no courtroom could restore them. The coconut grove, though cordoned off and declared a crime scene, still loomed over the community like a scar, a reminder of betrayal and horror. Some villagers whispered that not all the guilty had been caught. They pointed to Esteban's words, his hints about powerful men still at large. Was there a deeper conspiracy that had never been uncovered? Were the convicted truly the masterminds, or merely the pawns? The unanswered questions lingered like ghosts, haunting every conversation, every memory of that summer. For the families, closure came not in the courtroom, but in the rituals of mourning. They gathered in the church, lit candles, and read the names of the dead aloud, one by one, until the air was thick with sorrow. Some built small shrines in their homes, adorned with photographs, rosaries, and flowers. Others simply sat in silence, staring at the empty chairs at their tables. Closure, if it came at all, came slowly, in moments of shared grief, in the quiet acknowledgement that life would never be the same. The police, though praised for their perseverance, carried their own burden. They knew how close the case had come to collapsing under the weight of rumors and fear. They knew how easily evidence could have been overlooked, how easily justice could have been denied, and some of them too wondered if they had truly reached the bottom of the mystery. In the end, the resolution was both an ending and a beginning. The killers had been named, tried, and punished. The village could breathe again, though the air was still heavy with memory. But beneath the surface, questions still stirred. Questions about complicity, about silence, about how many others might have known but chosen not to speak, questions that might never find answers. The coconut grove remained, its trees growing taller each year, their roots entwined with the soil where so much horror had been buried. Some said the grove would never be the same, that it carried the weight of the dead in every leaf and shadow. Others believed it was cursed, a place where no one should ever set foot again. And yet, life went on. Children played, crops were harvested, the seasons changed. But the story of the grove, of the 46 bodies, and the truth that shocked the village, would never be forgotten. In the years that followed, the village tried to rebuild itself, but the coconut grove remained like a wound that never fully closed. Children grew up with whispered warnings never to wander too close. Parents kept their doors locked at night, and every gust of wind through the trees seemed to carry echoes of the voices that had been silenced there. The story of the 46 bodies became more than a case. It became a legend, passed from one generation to the next as both a cautionary tale and a chilling reminder of what human beings are capable of. For the families, time did what it always does. It dulled the sharpest edges of grief, but it never erased it. Photographs yellowed, chairs remained empty, birthdays came and went without celebration. Every face in the courtroom had heard the word guilty, but in their hearts, many still asked, why? Why here? Why them? What could possibly justify such horror? No verdict could answer that, and maybe that was the cruelest truth, that some questions were destined to remain unanswered forever. The villagers learned to live with suspicion in their veins. Trust, once so natural, became a fragile thing. Neighbors no longer left their doors open, no longer shared food without hesitation, no longer assumed that familiarity meant safety. If such darkness could grow in their own backyard, if men they once greeted at the market could bury bodies beneath the soil they all shared, then who could truly be trusted? The grove didn't just claim lives, it claimed innocence. And yet, there were lessons that survived, bitter as they were. Parents taught their children to speak up, to never stay silent if they saw or heard something wrong. People who had once ignored their instincts learned to listen to them. The case became a reminder that silence protects the guilty, and that fear is a weapon just as sharp as any machete dot in schools. Teachers who replaced Esteban spoke gently but firmly about vigilance. They encouraged students to ask questions, to think critically, to never assume that appearances told the whole story. And in church, sermons echoed with warnings about temptation, about the dangers of secrecy and greed. The tragedy reshaped not just the village, but the way people thought about their lives, their choices, and their responsibilities to each other. Still, there were nights when the weight of it all pressed too heavily. Nights when the coconut grove seemed to call out, daring someone to step into its shadows. Some villagers claimed they could hear voices there, whispers carried on the wind, cries that had not yet faded. Others avoided the place altogether, treating it like cursed ground, whether haunted by spirits or simply by memory. The grove became sacred in its own terrible way, a graveyard without markers, a scar the earth itself refused to heal. For outsiders who read the headlines, the story eventually became just another shocking case, filed away in the archives of true crime. But for the people who lived it, it was never just a headline. It was the silence at the dinner table, the empty seat in the classroom, the way a mother's eyes would glaze over at the sound of laughter that reminded her of the child she lost. It was the way trust was broken and could never be mended the same way. Again, perhaps that is the moral of it, or not simply that evil exists, or that justice can be found, but that every choice, every silence, every betrayal leaves ripples that spread far beyond what we can see. The men who conspired in that grove thought they were burying botanists, but what they really buried was a piece of the community's soul, and that loss will echo long after their names are forgotten. Even now, when the sun dips low and the trees cast long shadows across the ground, some villagers swear they feel eyes watching them from between the trunks. They walk faster, clutching their children's hands, whispering prayers under their breath. And maybe that's the truest legacy of the case, that fear lingers long after the crime is solved. And that memory itself can be a ghost. So when you hear the story of the 46 bodies in the coconut grove, remember this: evil doesn't always come from far away. Sometimes it grows quietly among us, watered by greed, fed by silence, hidden behind familiar smiles. And by the time we see it for what it truly is, it may already be too late. The grove is still there, its roots entwined with the bones of the past, its leaves whispering secrets in the wind. It stands as a monument to the dead and a warning to the living. And if you ever find yourself walking near its edge, you might feel it tooth the weight of 46 souls, the shadow of betrayal, and the chilling reminder that monsters aren't always strangers in the dark. Sometimes, they are the people you thought you knew all along.